A couple of weeks ago, I made a video about Riot Games' Riftbound, and I said in the title that I really wanted to tell you that the game was amazing. And in the video, I explained that while the core gameplay of Riftbound is really good and that the gameplay loop feels excellent, that there were significant balance issues which were really impeding me from fully enjoying the game. And this was a kind of common sentiment amongst players. Draven was too powerful. And Riot Games clearly identified that, and they indicated kind of shortly right before I made my video, or right after, I think right before, that there would likely be a balance patch after Chinese Nationals, which happened this last weekend. And the balance patch is here. You've probably already seen, I'm a little bit later to the game on this, but I typically record in the mornings, and the balance patch came out in the afternoon my time, so I had to wait till the next day to record. So what happened? What did they do? The balance patch is a big one, or balance patch. The ban list is a big one. It is a big swing at changing the metagame, and I think that what they did says a lot about what Riot's ban philosophy is going to be going forward. One other thing I said in my video was that I recognize that balance issues happen early in games' lifespans, in particular as developers are kind of sussing out exactly where they're allowed to put power in cards, and in particular with new mechanics and things that haven't been done in TCGs before, it can be especially challenging to balance cards that are involved in those new mechanics, like movement between battlefields, for example, in Riftbound. So what are the bans? There were 7 bans, 4 of them are cards, 3 of them are battlefields, and I've kind of grouped them into 4 groups, really. Let's quickly review what they all are, and then I'll talk about them in their groups. The bans were Called Shot, Scrap Heap, Draven Vanquisher, Fight or Flight for the 4 cards, and then the battlefield bans were Obelisk of Power, the Dreaming Tree, and Reaver's Row. So the first group of bans for me are the Miracle bans. The Miracle gameplay style, most notably seen in Draven, was identified as being too powerful, and I think that is that is a reasonable conclusion to come to. The combination in particular of Ezreal Prodigy plus Called Shot just turned this card that was supposed to be expensive on power, but very cheap on energy, and into something that was just very cheap on power and provided you both selection and card advantage, which was just like not a reasonable interaction to have in the game, really at all. I was even surprised to see Stack Deck survive this ban list, if I'm being really honest. So that's ban number 1. Called Shot was the biggest kind of offender in the Miracle deck, but Riot decided to hit a second card from the Miracle strategies as well in Scrap Heap, and what they said in their ban announcement, and I'll link it below because I do think it's important to read, is that they think that going forward, Miracle strategies were only going to get better, and they wanted to take a good chunk out of them now because they didn't view that strategy as something that was going to be particularly reasonable to have in the game long term. In particular, they cited that it's not really ideally in their design philosophy to have one player be taking a disproportionate number of game actions. So Scrap Heap also got hit. That to me was the most surprising one. Really kind of came out of left field. Uh, Obviously, core pillar of the Miracle strategies, particularly the Miracle strategies in red. But like I said, if you were really trying to hit the kind of Miracle game plan, I was a little surprised to not see something like Stack Deck go instead. That I think is actually the card that holds the deck together in a more meaningful way than a card like Scrap Heap. But I mean, it's not totally outrageous to see it get hit. Uh, Next, they intelligently, I think, identified that just hitting Miracle Draven would not make Draven go away. And so there's also a Draven ban in Draven Vanquisher. This ban is targeted very specifically at the mid-range Draven deck. It's trying to take some of the power away from that deck's early turns. The mid-range Draven deck does not play Called Shot or Scrap Heap, importantly, so those bans don't impact it. But the Draven Vanquisher ban is a substantial one and a very meaningful one. Draven Vanquisher being a 4-drop that you can play for no power that then has the capacity to generate gold to help you pay some costs going forward is obviously quite strong. And it's another card that cares about winning combats, which obviously the Draven deck is already set up to do very effectively and oftentimes in ways that feel cheap. And then lastly, they said that overall the chaos domain, the color purple, was too strong, and this is something that the whole community had identified for a long time, and so they decided to go after one card that they just felt like was generically too powerful in purple. This is the card that I highlighted in my video as the first thing that I would ban, which is Fight or Flight. Fight or Flight is one of those ones where I think they just missed on the rate for how powerful this effect is. Like, because of the nature of the way that games play out, being able to just pay 2 energy, no power, or just use 1 power and hide it in order to totally fog a 1v1 combat, and in Draven's case, win the combat, was just way too powerful. And then you add in the fact that this card has the versatility of also letting you bail out of battlefields if they do end up committing more units to the battlefield. It just felt too strong, and I think you'll likely see a version of this effect come back, but I think that it will likely be costed much higher. It probably has a power cost in it, probably isn't hideable, probably costs more energy. You know, like 3 in a purple feels way more appropriate for the power level of this card. And I think it's just one of those cases where early in development, not fully appreciating how powerful a card like this is, this slipped through and ended up getting printed. But I think its ban is a good one. This hits more or less every purple deck. I think there are a couple that don't play it, like Ezreal, for example. I don't think was necessarily on Fight or Flights, but they could have played it. And yeah, another good ban, I think, and probably enough in concert with the Called Shot and Scrap Heap bans to bring purple at least more in line with the rest of the colors. Currently, you've gotten rid now of like their kind of strongest card advantage engine, and certainly the worst feeling of the combat tricks that they have. One of the things that I think really puts a lot of pressure on you when you're playing against Chaos is there are just so many things they can have on 2, and even when they hide things, you know, they can have Fight or Flight, they can have Rebuke, they can have Switcheroo, and it's just like reducing the number of things you can get blown out by 1 even, I think is going to feel a good amount better. Then there are the battlefield bans. So they banned Obelisk of Power, citing its ubiquity. They said that this card appeared in too many decks, basically, and that it made game 2s feel too similar. For context, people would pick this card as their going second battlefield. I mean, not literally every deck was doing this, but like if you have a 4-drop champion, it's really powerful to know that you're going to be able to play your chosen champion on 2 or on 1, sorry, every time. And I understand both why people were playing it, but also why they decided that they wanted people to maybe do something different. I think the intention of Obelisk of Power was to be a ramp battlefield, to be a battlefield that the ramp decks reached for, but it was in fact just being used by basically everyone who was playing a 4-cost chosen champion, and some people even who weren't. Next is the Dreaming Tree. This is the battlefield that when you choose a unit here for the first time, you get to draw a card. This is the first really obvious targeting of Aurelia in particular. Aurelia was the other deck that was playable in this Draven meta. I think by the end of things, like obviously people played other decks. Victor got played, Ezreal got played, Kai'Sa got played. You know, you had people playing like Sivir as well. Like those decks were around, but in very, very low sample size very, very low representation in top cuts for sure. And the Dreaming Tree is a powerful battlefield in the Aurelia decks, just allows you to get card advantage for doing what the deck is already pretty interested in doing. And then they also banned Reaver's Row, and the intention here is that I think they just felt like the gameplay pattern around this was pretty bad. It was a battlefield where if you're playing against Draven and you take it, you can basically never retreat out of it without giving them a card, which feels quite bad. But then additionally, if you're playing against not Draven, like you're playing against an Aurelia or something like that, they can just basically never engage in a combat not on their own terms, which I think sensibly Riot identified as not an especially positive play pattern long term. It also had like some pretty scary implications with Stellar Cornherder in particular, where like you would attack into the battlefield, they would retreat their Stellar Corn and draw a card, and that never felt especially good. Another sensible ban, I think. So that's the bans, and that's the kind of the short reason why they made these bans. And I think it's certainly interesting that they chose to make such a big swing. In my first video, I sort of cited one change that they could make, and then I suggested they could make more if they still needed them. And I think what we can kind of glean from this decision is that they are likely hoping to not have to make bans that often, and certainly not have to make bans outside of set rotate or set release cycles, I guess. Obviously, Unleashed is coming out in China quite soon. Nationals was the last really big event there before Unleashed was going to come out, I believe, and so they made this choice on this cadence. And I think this says to me that they would not make another ban change. Say if they had made a smaller change before Unleashed and then Draven was still too good, they wouldn't have gone back and made another change very quickly. And so this is them saying we do not want two Draven metagames in a row. We want to make sure that there is something different going on going forward. So let's talk about what the metagame maybe looks like going forward. Okay, so we'll start. I'm going to do this in a kind of winners and losers format, and then we can maybe talk holistically about what the metagame is going to look like after that. So let's start with the losers. The big one, obviously, is Draven. Both versions of the Draven deck are getting at least one main deck card banned out, and then they are losing one of the better battlefields in terms of losing Reaver's Row. And additionally, Draven was an Obelisk of Power ban because you would an Obelisk of Power deck because you would play Draven Vanquisher as your chosen champion. Really clear, right? The Draven decks now have to play a chosen champion, which is significantly weaker or contextual. The Chaos Domain Draven, while playable, certainly, it costs 6, which is a lot worse coming out of the chosen champion zone. Or you can play the 5 cost and a power red one that gets more might based on your points if you really don't want to play the purple one. That one might be fine, honestly. Like that's maybe where I would start if I was playing Draven. But the deck is a really clear loser in both cases. Like the Miracle version feels pretty unplayable to me. I don't know that it's something that you can necessarily do. And the mid-range version I think will still exist. Obviously, like losing Fight or Flight and losing Draven Vanquisher is a noticeable hit. Although I will say, and I'm going to talk about this more later in the video, the rules update did not change the rules of combat in a way that renders Draven's legend ability weaker. You can still steal combats by rebuking your opponent's unit, and I do think that means that especially defensively, Draven is going to be challenging to attack into still. There is still Rebuke. We're getting a new card at Unleashed that allows you to stun, and then if you repeat it, you can even double stun or bounce something, which is going to be challenging to play around when you're playing against Draven. So it's not as though the deck is like fully dead, and drawing a card on every combat is still really powerful. So although Draven is a big loser, I'm not convinced you'll see zero Draven, if I'm being really honest. I do think that that's just a deck that is still registerable and is still going to be reasonable to play. Another obvious loser here is Aurelia. The Fight or Flight ban is an Aurelia ban. It hits her deck, and she used it in a less abusive way than Draven did, but she actually is, I think, a legend that used it in the more flexible way. You were more often also using it on your own units to move them back to base. You'll probably see Aurelia decks like pick up a third copy of Flash. They often play 2, and I would guess that they will now move up to playing the full 3 copies of that card because they really do want to be engaging in combats on their terms, not on yours. And so I do think you'll see that. But Aurelia is definitely a loser. She also lost one of her better battlefields. I've seen a lot of people suggesting that Aurelia is now tier 0 after these changes. And although she's like the most powerful legend besides Draven, I think currently, I do think these bans do bring her power level down a little bit. And then there's also additional metagame implications from Draven not being playable, or not being, he's still going to be playable, but from Draven not being oppressive, that mean that you'll see a more natural set of checks and balances on Aurelia. And I'll talk about that in the winners section. A couple of the other losers, obviously purple decks as a whole, like decks like Sivir and Misfortune, and Annie as well, were playing some number of these cards that were banned in the name of making Draven weaker. Draven Vanquisher appeared in many of these decks. Fight or Flight appeared in many of these decks. Obviously, the interaction between Called Shot and Ezreal was like a big reason to play that deck. I don't think that they're like fully dead by any means. It's not as though purple is unplayable all of a sudden because of these changes, but you're going to notice an appreciable downtick, I think, in that kind of playstyle potentially. There are other good cards though coming in Unleashed that'll likely bring those things back into being playable, and so it's not as though it's going to be a situation where they totally go away. I do think, just as an early projection, that in terms of the blue purple kind of like control decks, I think that once Diana comes out, you'll likely see her replace Ezreal, just because the Called Shot Ezreal Prodigy interaction was like the most attractive part of playing that deck as a control shell, from my perspective at least. But maybe I'm wrong. His signature spell is still really powerful. Arcane Shift still does lots of good things. So maybe you'll just still see him seeing play with the same amount of regularity. Lastly, this one is unsurprisingly also a purple legend, but Jinx really got kind of gutted by these changes. The Scrap Heap change is pretty bad for her, and she was also a Draven Vanquisher deck. Jinx was never a meta contender, and so like it's hard to feel that bad for her, but it is unfortunate that, you know, this deck that's like tier 4 got a card banned out of it that really meaningfully impacts it. Scrap Heap is not a card that deck will be able to replace very easily. Okay, so now moving on to the winners. Ironically, like Aurelia is also a winner in these set of changes. I think a lot of people were calling for more specific Aurelia bans in this list as well. It's worth noting like that at Chinese Nationals that the finals was actually an Aurelia mirror, so it's not as though Draven was the only deck winning anything, and it did put 5 copies in the top 8 at that event, so it's not as though it was underrepresented. But yeah, the finals was an Aurelia mirror. There were a litany of other Aurelias in the top 64 of that tournament, so she's the other deck that's played well into Draven. And I think the fact that she managed to avoid a Stellarcorn Herder in particular ban is a fist pumping moment. I think if you're an Aurelia player, that is one of the more powerful cards in terms of being an engine in the deck, and I think one of the cards that is potentially a little bit more objectionable from a design standpoint. It really is like kind of a crazy draw engine. So Aurelia, while also being a loser because she loses Fight or Flight, she loses her best battlefield. You know, she didn't lose as much as I think some people thought she might. So not a true winner, but maybe a side winner. One thing I will say, and like I mentioned earlier, some people have been suggesting that Aurelia is going to be like tier 0 or exceptionally powerful, and I think that that will not be the case. And one of the big reasons is that one of the bigger winners from these bans are like the blue-yellow control decks that have historically struggled. Victor in particular struggled pretty mightily into Draven. You just couldn't afford to like give up free combat losses, and the gameplay loop of the Victor deck involves using your one might tokens to take battlefields and then not caring if they die, and that obviously didn't work against a deck like Draven because you were just giving away cards, and so it was just like that was a really challenging matchup, and in particular the Miracle decks just drew too many cards. You couldn't remove them out of the game because they were just always so they always had so many cards in hand. So those decks are big winners, and the existence of blue-yellow decks will make Aurelia worse. Cards like Call the Weak in particular are really challenging for Aurelia to beat. She is very often going in on one unit, and those decks are able to really effectively deal with one unit in a way that doesn't choose it. It plays around a lot of the combat tricks that Aurelia has access to. And so I do think that you will potentially see a kind of like more natural metagame developing of, if there is a lot of Aurelia, you'll end up seeing blue-yellow, but also just like other yellow decks in general that are capable of playing Call the Weak rising up as a way to challenge her. I think blue-yellow is the really obvious winner though. Another deck that I would shout out as being a big winner is Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa had no changes and despite being the best deck from set one, was still playable in this set, albeit not at nearly the same metagame representation and not at the same representation of top finishes. But you would still always see Kai'Sa's hovering around the top 8. I think at both Vegas and at Chinese Nationals, I think Kai'Sa was 9th at both those tournaments, maybe 11th or something at Chinese Nationals. I can't remember exactly, but um, she's been around. She's still been playable. The chosen champion is still very powerful to consistently have access to on turn 2. Like that's an exceptionally powerful thing to be able to do. And she saw no changes. None of these cards are Kai'Sa changes, with the one exception of, I think some versions were on Draven Vanquisher, but that card is pretty replaceable, and you're getting a bunch of new toys in Unleashed as well. The Kai'Sa legend ability is just so good, and I do think that deck is a real winner, and you'll see an uptick in Kai'Sa play. I think that hold decks that are like Ari, for example, are going to see a bit of an uptick in play and are going to feel a lot better. Fight or Flight was such a problematic card for these decks to play into because it allowed your purple opponent to break your hold without engaging in a combat. And in particular for decks like Ari, that was something that she had an exceptionally challenging time dealing with. Obviously, you had access to Not So Fast and Defy as ways to play through these things, but if you're spending your resources on something like that and then they just challenge you in combat and they have another trick, it was really challenging. And so I do think it is a nice buff to these hold decks to not have to be playing against Fight or Flight anymore. And then lastly, I think Aurora decks are poised to get a pretty nice bump. One of the reasons why those decks struggled into Draven in particular is because of the kind of tempo game plan that both the Miracle and mid-range deck could take against them. Cards like Rebuke, even if they were paying like 4 power to rebuke something, typically they draw so many cards that would get so far ahead. Draven Vanquisher would make a couple of gold on the way up, that it was hard for these Aurora decks to play into Draven. And to make matters even more awkward, the Draven decks were capable of sideboarding answers to Aurora. So like if you ever just like slammed an Aurora, even if you got there, you were often behind a couple of points. They were probably up a bunch of cards. And then a lot of times they were like killing your Aurora, letting you draw 2, but they just didn't care, and then like bouncing your big unit that you had played, and it was just too hard to play into. So Aurora deck's the other big winner. So overall, what does the metagame look like coming out of this ban list? I think that it's interesting because I think that the things you have to look at for early contenders are the things that were good pre-Draven. And so obviously the big choices, and I think I've highlighted them here in my winner section, are Kai'Sa, I think looks to be quite strong. Victor, I think looks to be quite strong. I do think you'll still see Aurelia. And then I think that there's going to be an interesting kind of figuring it out process as players work out which decks that had previously been kept down by Draven are now powerful enough to compete in a new metagame. I, in particular, would look at things like Azir as a deck that might ultimately end up seeing a decent amount more play. One of the things that Azir does that is so powerful is it's really kind of annoying to play into him, because if you're a control deck that's just trying to 1-for-1 your opponent, well, Azir is just kind of slowly making a more and more difficult to remove unit, and they never really invest a full card because they're just using the Azir legend ability to make these sand soldiers. You know, you eventually probably run out of cards and you get kind of drowned. And I think Azir is a legend that I could see seeing some more play. Obviously, people had a little bit of success with it even in the Draven meta, so it's certainly playable. But it had particular problems into Draven because Draven got to kind of break those rules. You would remove the sand soldiers and still draw a card, and so as a result, you didn't really get to run your opponent out of resources in the way that you do against other decks. Other decks that I'm personally kind of excited about trying out with the new meta are Fiora. I think Fiora is one of these decks that is close. Riposte is an exceptionally powerful signature spell, and her legend ability to ramp when you make a unit mighty is very strong. It is an ability that comes up pretty cleanly with some of the good interactions that she has in her deck. She has good ways to draw cards. None of her big battlefields got banned. A lot of the more recent versions have been playing baited hook, but I think even you might just be able to play a more aggressively bent version of the deck that could be quite good. So those are things that where I would be starting, what I would be looking at. I think that too, if you are looking to still play purple, I think that the purple decks that look the most untouched by these changes, other than Aurelia, are probably Ezreal. I think that you could still pretty happily register Ezreal. I think it'll take some time to work out whether the called shot ban really kills that deck or if it still feels fine. You still have blue cards to draw cards, so it's not as though you were all in on these purple effects to gain advantage, and so that one might still be pretty decent. And then I also think that a deck like Sivir is something that you could still see people potentially registering, although I think that that deck maybe was relying on Fight or Flight and Call Shot a little more potentially than these other ones I've talked about. I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't also talk about the rules changes. They've been slowly clarifying things in the Discord, and I wanted to highlight the big ones, I think. Number one is the combat change that many people were expecting didn't happen. So you don't need to deal damage for it to count as a combat still. They're keeping the templating more or less. They codified it in the rules update to have a more specific kind of process for how exactly a combat goes on. But if you bounce a unit, you still count as winning a combat. As long as your unit is there at the end of a showdown and your opponent's is not, it qualifies as you winning a combat. It doesn't matter how you got to that state. So that's a big change for Draven. It's also a big change. Well, not a big change, sorry, but it's a big deal for Draven. It means that the legend is not fully dead. And I think that it means to me that they are intending to print quite a large number of these when I win a combat do X cards. Obviously, we know about Nidalee in Unleashed is coming up, and she also cares about winning combats. So clearly, this is an interaction that they have maybe intentionally balanced these effects around, it actually sounds like. And so leaving it as is clearly an intentional choice. And I think it's interesting. We'll see how it plays out. My big issue with the change, with not making the change, is I think that currently the wording is unintuitive. Like saying when I win a combat, to me, implies the exchange of damage or the comparison of might. And it's fine that it doesn't, but it feels unintuitive when you're explaining it to someone, which I think is a little bit awkward. The other big rules update that we got was a clarification to the way that equip works, and it's unfortunate. The way that the rules clarification works, it means now that Jax's legend ability doesn't allow you to unequip and re-equip the same equipment to the same unit. It's a big deal because Jax liked to do things like play Brutalizer, put it on a unit, and then kind of just flicker it to give it the when first equip bonus over and over again. Additionally, Jax really liked attaching equipment onto Aphelios over and over again to get advantage. And now you either need to have new equipment to put on him or you need to flick it back and forth between two different units. And Jax is another unit or another legend that's been on the periphery of playable. And I unfortunately think this change is like a pretty big nerf. It's one of those things where if you've played a lot of Jax, you know that this interaction comes up more often than you would think. Certainly more than once a game. You're trying to flicker something onto a unit that already exists. In particular, Brutalizer, but like also a lot of the games where you were able to pull ahead were the Aphelios games where you were able to kind of do stuff like that. And this just makes Jax as a whole like a bit less tricky, gives him a little less versatility. And I think in the wake of how many other decks are now going to feel so much better, it's a shame that Jax is going to feel so much worse. Okay, let's bring it all together and kind of and summarize. I've noticed that I end all of my videos by saying overall, so I have just now in my notes written overall as my indicator to end the episode. I think that these are good changes. Obviously, Riot decided to take a big swing and really try to meaningfully shake up the format without just relying on a new set coming out and the new cards making a change. And that's something that I think needs to be applauded and is admirable. It is really easy, I think, for developers to fall into this trap of saying, well, we've got 300 new cards coming out, and surely something in there will shake up the meta. And how can we really make choices about bans when we have a new set coming out and the new set might change the meta? Like, that's something that Wizards in particular has been very guilty of in the past, and of basically saying like, well, the meta, sure, the meta's bad, but it might change in a month when we release the next set. And Riot has very clearly said, okay, yeah, we're not going to do that. And we identified that the meta is bad and we're going to change the meta now. And I think that is certainly something to be applauded. So overall, I think you can't feel that negative about these changes kind of no matter what. But what's also interesting is the way in which Riot went about making these changes. They said in their article about the changes that they viewed banning a legend as the absolute last resort. Like, they don't want to do it because they want people to be able to play the legends that they want to and that they kind of like maybe enjoy from the games. And I think that is a very reasonable perspective to take. And I applaud their willingness to be as open in that communication as well, and to kind of say, hey, if you're hoping for a legend ban, just so you know, it's not very likely to happen. That being said, I do wonder if they could do something like, say, like One Piece did, where they banned Nami and then released a fixed version of Nami as kind of a promo that went direct into the format. There's a lot of logistical issues behind doing something like that, so I understand why not every game doesn't just like immediately do that, because it's obviously non-trivial. But like, part of me wonders, like, how crazy would like a Draven that just exhausts use his ability go? Like, is that already just like way better? And they said they didn't want to do erratas either unless they had to, which I totally appreciate. I think that errata is a really inelegant way to solve problems in card games, because then people's cards don't do what they say, and that's a pretty negative thing, all things considered. The other thing that I think is worth noting is, so they didn't ban a legend. They've said they don't want to ban a legend. And the other interesting thing is they went after a smattering of commons and uncommons and one rare, I guess, in Draven Vanquisher, rather than going after the maybe like higher impact rare cards. So for example, they hit Called Shot instead of hitting Ezreal Prodigy. And in that case, I think everyone kind of agrees Called Shot is the objectionable card, and Ezreal Prodigy is a side effect. It just kind of enables a good card to be even better. But it's worth noting that like that's the change pattern that they've gone for, that they're looking to ban commons rather than banning the more like high power rares. It would, I think, have been kind of easy to look at this Draven deck, to look at like the mid-range version, for example, and to say like, oh, well, yeah, maybe we need to ban like like Bring Here Thunder Song, or we want to ban like one of these, like maybe we want to ban Kaisa Survivor out of this deck because it's been problematic in the Kaisa deck as well. And they very clearly made a choice not to do that, which is interesting. And I wonder if that's something that they're always going to be able to do. But clearly they don't want people to feel as though like their rares are like their rares, and more importantly, I guess their epics are likely to get like banned out from under them right away, which I think is like a nice thing as well to see. Obviously, you can't assume that they're always going to make changes in this way. The last thing I'll say, and the last thing I really appreciate about these changes, is that they are a big swing that was made quickly. One thing that I praised Star Wars Unlimited for in my video about the history of that game's first meta, like the first 6 sets of that game, was that Fantasy Flight was very willing to make changes aggressively when things became objectionable. And to me, Riot has done a really good job of approaching it in the same way here. They made changes in the grand scheme of things pretty quickly. When it became obvious that it was objectionable. We had one big event in Europe, one big event in North America, a couple of big events in China that were dominated by Draven. And at that point, Riot stepped in and said, it's too good. We agree it's too good. And there was even communication before the last large event in China where they had clearly indicated that they were aware that there was a power outlier here, and they stepped in and made changes. And I think that if you're someone who's really hoping for Riftbound's long-term success, this is really encouraging to see. The reality of modern trading card games is the odds that they come out balanced are really low. And even the odds that they are balanced really like super often are not crazy, crazy high either. There just are going to be broken decks found. And Draven is like a really exceptional example of this, where it got to like 65% win rate in some instances. But even like a 58%, a 59% win rate deck is going to feel bad and will likely require some amount of changes. Probably not on the same scale as the changes they made here. Sorry, I hit my coffee cup. I'm really feeling passionate about this. But they're going to have to make changes, and it's nice to see that Riot has clearly accepted that that is the thing they're going to have to do, and they've demonstrated a willingness to do it. Overall, I'm really excited about the future of Riftbound. I feel way more confident that I can tell you it is a great game now. I think that they have resolved a lot of the balance concerns that I had. And the combat change is something that I still think they might have to make eventually. We'll see how Draven feels long term. A lot of these cards that were banned in the context of Draven are potentially replaceable if enough powerful cards come out, and his legibility is still just crazy. So we'll see if eventually maybe something needs to be actioned on Draven specifically in a more targeted fashion. But clearly for now, Riot feels like this will be enough. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you've made it all the way to the end, I hope you'll subscribe. It really helps me out. And without further ado, I'll see you in the next one.